When the house finally burned in 1865, the people of Charleston said it screamed. They said the walls cried like women and the air smelled of birth and blood. But long before the fire, the widow of Charleston had already burned not by flame, but by her own sins carried in the wombs of her daughters. When the old house finally burned in 1865, the people of Charleston said it screamed. They claimed its timbers moaned like women in labor, and the air around it thickened with the smell of birth and blood, as if the very earth beneath it was purging something foul. But long before the fire consumed it, Gracefield had already died not by flame, but by sin. And at the heart of that sin stood a woman they called the Widow of Charleston. Gracefield Plantation sat at the edge of the Ashley River, a proud sprawl of white columns and moss-draped oaks, where the light always seemed filtered, as though reluctant to touch the place directly. The fields stretched endlessly into the humid horizon, where the cries of laborers rose with the drone of cicadas. For decades, it had been a symbol of southern grace and wealth. Its rice pad is glittering under the sun like veins of gold. But by the year 1836, the Delacroix fortune was withering, and with it, so was its last mistress, Margaret Delacroix, the widow of Charleston. She was 41 that year, her beauty a memory fading behind the pale veil of mourning. Her husband, Thomas Delacroix, had died of yellow fever 2 summers before, leaving her 2 daughters, a decaying estate, and debts that shadowed every waking thought. Charleston was changing. The old families clung to their wealth like ghosts to their graves, while disease and drought picked the region clean. Margaret stood each morning on the veranda, watching the fields. The air smelled of mud, salt, and despair. The enslaved workers were fewer now, sold off to keep the estate afloat. Those who remained were thin, quiet, and wary. The overseer, Jonas Bell, a broad man with eyes like steel nails, had once served her husband. Now he served her, though his loyalty came with a price. Gracefield was not merely a plantation, it was a relic of pride. Every portrait in its halls told a story of power: men with powdered wigs, women in lace, children painted beside dogs and horses, all frozen in a world that no longer existed. The Delacroix had always seen themselves as builders, architects of Charleston's grandeur. But behind every brick and chandelier, behind every glass of imported wine, lay the backs of those who had built it, unpaid and unseen. When Thomas died, Margaret discovered the truth of that empire. Everything had been borrowed from banks, from other families, even from traders across the Atlantic. Gracefield was drowning in debt. And in 1836, a widow's options were few. Her daughters Eveline, 16, and Clara, 14, were her only treasures left untouched. Eveline had her father's gentle eyes, though they were often clouded by doubt. Clara was quieter, fragile, and inward, with a mind that wandered like the river tides. They adored their mother, still believing her to be the strong, unbreakable figure who could command any room. But the widow of Charleston was not unbreakable anymore. She was desperate. It began with the whispers of Jonas Bell. He had come to her one evening, hat in hand, his voice soft as syrup. "Missus," he said, "the markets in Savannah are changing. A healthy young girl now fetches more than a whole season's cotton." He paused, watching her reaction. "If we breed 'em right, Gracefield might yet stand." At first, Margaret did not understand. "Breed," she repeated, her lips tightening. "You speak of cattle, Jonas, not people." But that night she could not sleep. The candles burned low, and the silence pressed against her ribs. She sat by her husband's portrait, staring into his painted eyes. He had left her nothing but land and shame. The banks were closing in, her name whispered in drawing rooms with pity and amusement. The proud Delacroix widow, they said, reduced to begging for loans. Something in her broke that night, or perhaps something long buried awoke. She began to think not as a woman, but as a survivor. If men could use lives as currency, why couldn't she? By dawn, the decision was made. The following weeks brought quiet horror cloaked in the pretense of management. Margaret began to treat her enslaved women as assets to be paired, their bodies listed in ledgers beside the value of tools and horses. She spoke of it clinically, as if birth could be reduced to numbers. "A strong line," she said, "will save us all." Gracefield became a house of forced creation cries, muffled by the walls, births hidden under the sound of rain. Margaret told herself it was necessity, that once the estate recovered, she would make things right. She prayed more often, yet her prayers sounded hollow, more like bargains with a God she no longer trusted. But money, once tasted, demands more, and soon, even her new line of workers was not enough. The market wanted more lighter skin, finer features, girls who could be trained as servants for the new city homes rising across the South. It was Jonas Bell who made the final suggestion, his words like poison wrapped in sugar. "Your girls," he said one evening, "they've got the look them traders pay gold for. You could save it all, Mrs. Your name, your land, your daughter's futures. One arrangement, just one." Margaret slapped him. The sound cracked through the parlor like a pistol shot. Jonas said nothing, only bowed and left, but the seed had been planted, and seeds, when watered by fear, grow fast. Weeks passed. The debts grew heavier. Eveline, ever dutiful, asked her mother what was wrong. "You look pale, Mama," she said. "Are we to lose the house?" Margaret smiled, brushing her daughter's hair. "Never, my love. This house is our blood, and a mother's blood protects her children." A letter came from Mr. Edwin Cartwright, a planter from Savannah, a man twice Margaret's age, known for buying mixed trace housemaids. He offered a business proposal, an alliance. He called it a temporary arrangement that would ensure both families' prosperity. He was willing to invest in the Delacroix recovery in exchange for Eveline's companionship. Margaret read the letter 3 times. Her hands trembled. She felt sick. Yet by nightfall she had written her reply. Eveline never knew the truth. Her mother told her it was a courtship. She was to travel to Savannah, stay under Cartwright's protection, and in doing so, secure Gracefield's salvation. Eveline resisted at first, weeping in her sister's arms. But Margaret spoke with the authority of command and love intertwined. "You must trust me, my child. We are Delacroix women. Our duty is sacrifice." On the morning she left, the house smelled of magnolia and sorrow. Clara stood on the porch, clutching Eveline's hand. "You'll come back soon," she whispered. Eveline nodded through her tears. Margaret watched the carriage roll away until it disappeared down the dusty road. She stood there long after, her eyes fixed on the horizon as though waiting for her soul to return with it. Eveline never came back. After that, something inside the widow hardened completely. She stopped attending church. She rarely ate. The neighbors said she was consumed by grief, but grief was too soft a word. What lived in her was colder survival shaped into cruelty. When Clara turned 15, Jonas Bell began to linger near her too often. Margaret noticed but said nothing. She told herself she was protecting the girl by silence, that the world was too cruel to save anyone with truth. Clara spent most of her days in the attic painting. She used crushed berries and soot as her colors, smearing them on scraps of old letters. Her art was the only way she could breathe in that heavy house. One night, she painted her mother's face on the wall, pale, sharp, and hollow, and beneath it, she scrawled a single word, sin. Margaret saw it days later. She didn't erase it. By 1839, rumors began to swirl among the enslaved families. They said the widow had made deals with devils, that girls were being taken from their quarters to bear children that would never stay. The cries at night grew frequent. Jonas Bell's laughter carried through the corridors, and in the mornings Margaret would walk the fields, her skirts brushing against the damp grass, her expression fixed as stone. She began to keep a ledger, names, dates, descriptions. She hid it beneath the floorboards of her study, locking it with a brass clasp. Each line of ink was another transaction of flesh. She told herself it was mercy that those children would have better lives elsewhere. But mercy never sounded so much like justification. Clara grew pale and thin. One night she confronted her mother. "Where is Eveline?" she demanded. Margaret stared at her, her eyes empty. "Your sister saved us." "How?" "By doing what must be done. And now I must do the same." Clara's voice trembled. Margaret didn't answer. That night the girl packed her small bag, intending to flee, but as she crept down the back stairs she found Jonas waiting. He said her mother had sent him to fetch her back. She screamed, but no one came. Gracefield's walls absorbed the sound as they always had. By morning, the widow of Charleston sat at the breakfast table, her tea untouched. Jonah's Bell stood by the doorway, his hat in his hands. Clara's footsteps were silent above them, a silence that would haunt the house forever. Years passed. The estate flourished again, the markets recovered, and the Delacroix name regained its whisper of respect. But within the house, something vile thrived. Children were born in secrecy, sold in silence. Letters came from Savannah with money and no words. Margaret burned them without reading. Eveline's name was never spoken aloud again. Clara rarely left her room, her paintings now dark rivers of red, faces without eyes. At night, the slaves whispered stories of the house itself turning against its mistress. They said the floors creaked not from age, but from the weight of souls. That sometimes, when the moon rose full, one could see a young woman's face in the upstairs window pale, watching, waiting. And yet, to the world outside, Gracefield gleamed. The widow hosted luncheons for visiting merchants, dressed in her finest mourning silk. She spoke of faith, of endurance, of the Delacroix legacy. No one asked about her daughters, no one dared, but within her the silence grew unbearable. She began to see shadows in the corners, hear faint humming from the attic. Clara's humming. Sometimes she swore she heard Eveline's laughter carried on the river wind. She prayed again, not for forgiveness, but for forgetfulness. It never came. The summer of 1845 brought another flood. The Ashley River swelled, swallowing the lower fields. The water lapped at the steps of the house, muddy and relentless. Margaret stood on the veranda, watching it rise. Jonah's Bell, old and limping, came to her side. "We can rebuild, Mrs.," he said. She turned to him slowly. "No," she whispered. "We already built this house on bones. Let it drown." For a moment, the mask slipped. In her eyes flickered the memory of the woman she once was, soft, kind, afraid. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared. She straightened her shoulders and walked back inside. Behind her, the river murmured like a prayer denied. The summer of 1852 arrived heavy and wet, the air thick as honey and twice as suffocating. Gracefield's once golden fields were streaked with green rot, and the mosquitoes bred like curses in the standing water. Inside the house, time itself seemed to move slower, as if reluctant to touch what it knew was dying. The widow of Charleston, Margaret Delacroix, was no longer the commanding figure she once had been. Her hair, once wheat, blonde and proud, had turned gray and brittle like the ashes in her hearth. Her daughters were women now, though their eyes carried the weight of children who had seen too much. Eveline had returned from Savannah 2 years earlier. No letters had come before her, no word of warning, only a carriage that appeared one fog, thick morning, its wheels whispering on the gravel. When she stepped out, she was unrecognizable, thin, pale, her voice gone to a whisper, as though speech itself hurt her. She would not speak of what had happened there, not to her mother, not to her sister. But her silence said everything. Clara, now 20, stayed mostly in the attic, still the painter turned ghost. She painted not in color anymore, but in charcoal and ash, filling the walls with faceless figures and dark rivers. Her eyes had lost their brightness. She had grown careful, her words measured like a prisoner speaking to a guard. The widow watched them both and told herself that all of this was necessary. That she had saved them, that she had sacrificed for them, not with them. But even she did not believe it anymore. Eveline spent her days reading scripture, though her hands trembled as she turned each page. Her voice, when it came, was soft but haunted. "Mother," she said one evening as the cicadas screamed through the open shutters, "you taught us to believe in providence. But what if providence was never meant to forgive us?" Margaret, seated at her writing desk, froze. Her quill hovered above the ledger she still kept, though she no longer wrote new names, only rewrote the old ones, as if rearranging the letters might rearrange the past. "Do not speak to me of forgiveness," she said, her tone sharp as cracked glass. "We did what we had to survive." Eveline's eyes filled with quiet tears. "You sold survival to the devil, Mother." Margaret struck the table so hard the ink jar fell, spilling black across her papers like blood over bone. She stood trembling, her lips pale. "Do not judge me," she hissed. "You do not know hunger. You do not know what it is to watch your world fall piece by piece." But Eveline did not flinch. She only whispered, "Yes, I do. You are my world." For the first time, Margaret turned away. The words struck her like a wound she could not conceal. That night, she burned the ledgers in the hearth, but when the smoke rose, it carried a smell she could not bear. Flesh, memory, regret. The fire did not cleanse her. It only made the house colder. Clara had not spoken to her mother in weeks. She spent most nights in the servants' quarters, helping the few who remained, sketching their children, painting their names on small scraps of cloth. One of them, an older woman named Abigail, had been midwife to every birth on Gracefield, free and enslaved alike. One humid night, Abigail came to her quietly. "Miss Clara," she whispered, "he's awake again." Clara followed her through the narrow corridor to the far end of the quarters, where the walls leaned inward and the candles barely held their flame. There, hidden beneath a threadbare blanket, lay a boy, Samuel, 6 years old, with bronze skin and eyes the color of green glass. His gaze was curious, unafraid. He reached out a hand toward her. "Mama," he said softly. Clara knelt beside him and gathered him into her arms. He was her son, the one she had hidden from her mother, the one she had sworn the world would never find. Born of violence, yet living proof that love could survive even in hell. Abigail placed a trembling hand on Clara's shoulder. "He's a good boy, miss, but you can't hide him much longer. Folks talk, and Mrs. Margaret, she hears everything." Clara's heart tightened. She knew the old woman was right. Every whisper in Gracefield carried to the widow's ears eventually. Yet she would rather die than let Samuel be sold, or worse, taken into that same cycle of blood and ownership. She began to plan their escape. Savannah, perhaps, or further north, where people whispered of freedom. But plans, like seeds in poisoned soil, rarely took root at Gracefield. It was Margaret herself who found the child. She had gone to the quarters one afternoon, unannounced, the first time in years she had crossed that threshold. Her reason was simple: fear, rumors of theft, missing supplies. She moved through the rooms like a ghost in silk, her eyes sharp and searching. And there, in the farthest room, she found him, a child asleep in Clara's arms, his small hand curled around her finger. For a long moment she said nothing. The sight struck her like lightning, her daughter, her flesh, holding a child that should not exist. The boy stirred, opened his eyes and looked at her with unnerving calm. "Who is he?" Margaret asked quietly. Clara's breath caught. "He's mine." Silence stretched between them like a drawn blade. The air turned heavy, the sound of the river faint beyond the walls. Margaret's face hardened, the softness evaporating. "You have undone everything I built," she whispered. "Do you understand what this means?" Clara rose, clutching Samuel protectively. "It means there's still something human left in this house." Her mother's eyes glinted like steel. "No, it means weakness. It means ruin." When she turned and left, the sound of her footsteps on the wooden floor was measured, final, the sound of judgment. That night, Samuel was gone. Abigail found the boy's blanket beside the riverbank at dawn. There were no footprints beyond it, no signs of struggle, just the soft drag of something carried away by the tide. Clara searched until her feet bled. She screamed his name into the reeds until her voice broke, until the only sound that came back was the low hum of the marsh. Margaret never spoke of it. When Clara confronted her, wild-eyed and trembling, the widow only said, "The Lord gives and takes. You should not have hidden him from me." Clara struck her, then the sound echoing through the grand hall like the shattering of glass. For a moment the two women stood frozen, mother and daughter, mirror and reflection both broken, both bound by choices they could never undo. Clara fled that night. Some said she took the road to Savannah. Others swore they saw her wading into the river, her dress white under the moon, calling her son's name until the water silenced her. Margaret never searched for her. By 1861, the world beyond Gracefield was unraveling. The first cannons of war thundered across Charleston harbor. The widow watched from her veranda as smoke rose in the distance, not from her own fields this time, but from Fort Sumter itself. The Confederacy was crumbling, and the old order with it. The very system that had fed her house, her name, her sins was dying. Yet she clung to it like a drowning woman to driftwood. Eveline had changed, no longer fragile. She carried herself with quiet strength. She had taken in the remaining servants as equals, feeding and clothing them despite her mother's protests. "The world is changing," she told Margaret. "Gracefield cannot stand on bones forever." Margaret ignored her. She spent her days locked in her study, writing letters to no one, her mind fracturing between memory and delusion. At night, she walked the halls, speaking to the air as if her daughters were still there, as if Clara might walk in at any moment with her child. Sometimes she thought she heard Samuel laughing, a light, distant sound, carried on the river wind. By 1865, the Union Army had reached Charleston. Soldiers moved through the countryside, burning estates, freeing those enslaved, erasing the Old South one mansion at a time. When they came to Gracefield, the house stood empty of laughter, but heavy with ghosts. Eveline begged her mother to leave. "Please, Mama," she cried, "they're coming. They will destroy everything." Margaret stood by the window, looking out over her ruined fields. The sun was setting, bleeding red across the sky. "Let them," she said softly. "I have nothing left worth saving." Eveline grabbed her shoulders. "You have me." But Margaret only smiled, a small, cracked smile. "I lost you long ago." The soldiers arrived at dusk. They found the gates open, the path lined with overgrown lilies. Eveline ran to meet them, her hands raised in surrender. "Please," she said, "there is an old woman inside. She means no harm." But by the time they entered the house, it was already aflame. It began in the study, a single candle left, burning beside a pile of old letters and ledgers. The drapes caught first, then the rug, then the walls themselves. The fire spread like vengeance, feeding on the dry wood, the paper, the sins that had soaked into every inch of that house. Witnesses said they saw Margaret standing at the upstairs window, dressed in black, her gray hair catching the firelight like a halo of flame. She did not scream, she did not run. She simply stood there, hands clasped, watching the world she had built dissolve around her. Some swore they saw two figures beside her, faint, like smoke, one tall, one smaller, both with faces they couldn't quite make out. Mother and daughters, together again at last. The roof collapsed before anyone could reach her. When the fire died, only the foundation remained, and the ashes of a family that had built its fortune on sorrow. In the months that followed, freedmen and soldiers sifted through the ruins. They found little, a few charred coins, a melted comb, fragments of porcelain. But beneath the collapsed floorboards of the study, they discovered something else, a chest, burned but intact. Inside were ledgers, brittle pages filled with names, dates, and prices, the record of lives bought and sold. Among them were entries marked differently, written in finer ink: Eveline, Clara, and a series of initials that no one could decipher. Eveline returned one last time to Gracefield's ashes. She buried the ledgers by the river, near the spot where Clara had once painted lilies. Then she planted real lilies, their white as forgiveness, fragile as truth. When asked by a Union officer why she did it, she answered simply, "No mother should profit from her children, and no daughter should inherit her mother's sin." Years later, travelers along the Ashley River spoke of strange music drifting across the water. A woman's voice, low and mournful, singing in a language older than the house itself. Some said it was Clara, still searching for her son. Others said it was Margaret, weeping for the lives she had taken. But those who knew the land best, those who had worked its soil, buried their dead in its shadows, said it was neither. They said it was the river itself, finally speaking, telling the story no one else would tell. And if you stand there today, where the lilies bloom wild and the ruins lie hidden beneath the moss, you can still hear it, the song of Gracefield, not a song of punishment nor of forgiveness, but of memory. Because sin, like blood, does not vanish. It seeps, it stains, it teaches if we are brave enough to listen. They say that on still nights, when the tide is high and the moon lays silver on the Ashley River, you can hear singing from the marsh a woman's voice, low and mournful. Some say it's Clara calling her son. Others say it's the widow herself, weeping for what she built. But the old families of Charleston still tell this tale as a warning that greed can turn love to cruelty, and that even a mother's heart, when blinded by survival, can become a weapon. And somewhere beneath the lilies at Gracefield, the soil remembers, because sin, like blood, never truly disappears, it only seeps deeper into the earth. No legacy built on suffering can survive. The true measure of love is not what we keep, but what we refuse to destroy to keep it.